All right, fantastic. Well, good to see everybody either late this morning or early this afternoon. Welcome on behalf of the Strauss Center for International Security and Law at the University of Texas. We'd like to welcome you to the first installment of our new Meanwhile Around the Globe series, in which experts bring us up to speed on critical developments in foreign affairs, apart from the ongoing pandemic, although I'm sure that will make an appearance, if not in the text in the discussion. Second, I'd like to note it's the final event of the year for our Brumley Graduate Fellowship Program. The Brumley program awards fellowships to a select group of UT grad students from across campus, matching them with faculty advisors and mentors supporting their research and having each student select and host a talk by a star in their field. And that's why we're here today. You're not here to hear from me, but rather from our Brumley Fellow, Megan Bennett, who will introduce our speaker and be our host for this session. Megan is a Brumley Next Generation Grad Fellow who's a third year in our MGPS program at the LBJ School and in the Middle Eastern Studies program, where she is one of the few students who is able to gain some level of proficiency in both Arabic and Persian. Phenomenal. Her research examines, yes, intelligence, policy, diplomacy, and strategic communications. She's had an extensive work history and interesting background, having interned at the State Department last summer, and she's also had prior experience as a private contractor working in the Middle East and as a veteran of the U.S. Army. She served as a linguist in military intelligence, including a few tours in the Middle East. Now, I'm going to hand over the session to Megan. We are scheduled to go for about an hour. Please note that each participant's mic should be muted, and Megan already has questions submitted by our Brumley Fellows. With that, my role here is done, and I look forward to hearing from Megan and our guest speaker, Dr. Wittes. So Megan, over to you.
Thank you. So I'd like to introduce Tamara Wittes. She served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs from November of 2009 to January 2012, coordinating U.S. policy on democracy and human rights in the Middle East during the Arab uprisings. Wittes is also co-host of Rational Security, a weekly podcast on foreign policy and national security issues. She's currently writing a book, Our SOBs, on the tangled history of America's ties to autocratic allies. Wittes joined the Brookings Institution in December of 2003, where she is currently a senior fellow in the Center for Middle East Policy. Previously, she served as a Middle East specialist at the U.S. Institute for Peace and the director of programs at the Middle East Institute in Washington. She also taught courses in international relations and security studies at Georgetown University. Wittes was one of the first recipients of the Rabin Perez Peace Award established by President Bill Clinton in 1997. Founder of the Leadership Council for Women in National Security and also serves on the board of the National Democratic Institute. And so I'll hand it over to you. Thank you. Please welcome Dr. Wittes.
Oh, Megan, thank you so much for the invitation to join you and your colleagues today. I was really looking forward to being in Austin with all of you, and Bobby had promised me a great meal, and I'm very sorry to miss the opportunity to spend the day with you and see you in person, but really glad that we were able to preserve some capacity to engage virtually, and looking forward to more conversation with you. And thanks to Bobby and Alan and Lindsay and the IT support crew at UT Austin for making this happen this morning. I think for anyone who cares about politics and policy in this country, the last few years of turmoil in Washington have been challenging. And one of the lessons that I've taken away from that experience is how important it is for those of us who work in Washington and work on policy in a day-to-day way to spend more time talking to the rest of our country about what the United States does around the world in our foreign policy and why it matters. And so I really appreciate the commitment that UT Austin has through the Strauss Center, through this Fellows Program, to engage with questions of public policy and especially foreign policy and national security. So we're gathering this morning at kind of an inflection point in terms of the role that the United States plays in the Middle East. And we're having a bit of a national debate about that. For those of you who watched the Democratic presidential debates on television, for example, you would have seen a couple months ago that about half an hour of one of those debates was a discussion amongst the candidates about whether the United States should have military forces in the Middle East. Do we want them there or not? How many? Doing what? And so this is part, I think, of a broader questioning about America's role in the world, coming off of a long period of international leadership, international engagement by the United States. And a lot of Americans are questioning what we've achieved. How valuable is that international engagement? How much should we invest in sustaining that degree of engagement? And there are some things going on here at home that are forcing that debate. I think those trends are going to be exacerbated by the pandemic and the economic crisis that it created. But there are also changes in the international system and changes in the Middle East itself that are helping to drive that debate. And so what I want to do in the next few minutes, and I'll try not to talk for more than half an hour so we have time for questions, but I want to talk first about the changes that are going on globally and in the Middle East that are helping to drive this debate about the American role in the region. And then I want to talk a bit about what it takes when we want to translate our analytical understanding about what's going on in the world into the policy work of deciding what the United States government should do in the world. Because as you'll hear from my own experience, I've taken away a set of lessons about the ways in which those are two very, very different sets of tasks. So let's start by talking about those changes in the world that affect the way we think about the Middle East, the way we think about where the Middle East fits into America's global interests and foreign policy interests. One big change is, in the structure of international power. Since 1989, since the end of the Cold War, we've had a very long period where the United States was the unchallenged global hegemon. No one could match us militarily, economically, or in terms of our political and diplomatic weight. And that unipolar moment lasted for more than 2 decades, but it is now over. We are in an era of renewed geopolitical competition across the globe. We have rising political challenges and military challenges from Russia and China, rising economic challenges from China, and these new competitors on the global stage. They're not new competitors, but they are newly competitive on the global stage. And that demands that our government think about how we want to compete in the world with these other major powers. And so as we think about how our economy competes with the Chinese economy, how our tech competes with Chinese tech, how our energy sector competes with the Russian energy sector, we also have to think about opportunity costs for the United States of being so deeply invested in one region of the world as we have been in the Middle East over the last couple of decades. The opportunity costs of that intensive focus on the broader Middle East, those opportunity costs are rising. And so that's one thing that's driving the debate we're having now about how much the Middle East matters to us. Another thing that is driving that debate is changes in global energy markets. When the United States first engaged militarily, politically, economically in the Middle East, when we first sent our military into the Middle East, it was in the immediate aftermath of World War II. We were a large, growing industrial power, hungry for energy, and the energy that powered the industrial age was fossil fuel. It still largely is. And we therefore wanted to help secure the flow of fossil fuels, not only to our own economy, but to the world. And the more the United States became a global trading power the more integrated our economy became with other parts of the world, the more the supply of energy to the globe, not only to us, mattered to the United States. And so the United States made explicit commitments and enforced those commitments with the use of military force in the Persian Gulf to protect the free flow of energy to global markets. Today, we are in increasingly a different era in terms of global energy markets. We're in an era in which Middle Eastern oil is still very important, but its share of the global energy supply is shrinking. It's shrinking not because there's less oil in the Middle East, but because other supplies have come online from other places, from West Africa, from the shale industry in the United States and Canada, and also because newer energy demand is shifting to non-fossil fuel sources of energy. And so some countries who are developing their industrial economies now are leapfrogging beyond fossil fuels to solar and other non-fossil fuel sources of energy. So if you think about it, back in World War II, President Roosevelt met with King Abdulaziz of Saudi Arabia to offer an American commitment to help the kingdom exploit its oil deposits and bring them to world markets. And for decades after that, American secretaries of energy would regularly fly to Riyadh to sit down and talk with the king in Saudi Arabia about how to keep oil prices stable and not too high, to keep our economy and the global economy well fueled. We don't do that anymore. I actually cannot think of the last time that the US Energy Secretary flew off to Riyadh to talk about global energy prices. And that is an indicator that Middle Eastern energy matters less to us than it used to. Now, if you think about the recent oil price war between Saudi Arabia and Russia, that's crashed prices. And then the COVID pandemic, which drastically lowered demand for oil, crashed prices further. And we have had conversations between the President of the United States and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia about oil prices, because the crash in prices harmed our domestic producers. The costs to our producers are higher than they are to the Saudis. And so when prices are this low, it doesn't make sense for our producers to keep pumping in the same way. But what we've seen is that it's actually been quite difficult for Saudi Arabia to manage prices in this period in the way that they want to. They've struggled to try and reestablish production agreements within OPEC and outside OPEC to try and stabilize oil prices. And that is more evidence of the way in which the leverage that Middle Eastern producers have long had over global energy markets, that leverage has declined. There's one further change in the global environment that I want to talk about. And that is a shift in the kinds of security challenges that the Middle East produces that matter to the United States. What drove American military and security engagement in this region historically, again, in that period after World War II, beginning especially in 1956 and moving on until fairly recently, what drove American concern was interstate war and the threat of interstate war and the consequences of interstate war. And primarily what we're talking about in that second half of the 20th century is Arab-Israeli war. We had wars between Arab states and Israel in 1948, 1956, 1967, 1973. If you include the Israeli war with the PLO in Lebanon, 1982. These interstate wars were deeply destabilizing for the region, and in the context of the Cold War, they threatened US-Soviet confrontation, and they created advantages and disadvantages for the Soviets in the Middle East in ways that concern the United States. And so the US got involved in managing this region to secure energy supplies and to deal with the threat of interstate conflict and its consequence on the Cold War. But today, the security threats that face the Middle East and that implicate American interests from the Middle East are very different. Civil conflict, mass migration, which is both conflict induced, but also climate induced and economically induced, and terrorism and insurgency. These are very different security challenges than we have traditionally dealt with in this region. They demand a very different response. And 19 years of experience in Iraq and Afghanistan show us that large deployments of US military forces do not resolve these security challenges. That doesn't mean that there's no role for the US military in dealing with these security challenges, but it is not the same picture that we were looking at 30 or 40 years ago. And that is also driving a lot of our domestic debate today about the US role in the Middle East. Now, this shift in our own thinking about this region that has been such a focus of American policy for so much of the last 2 decades, this shift has come along with a lot of change in the Middle East itself. And so I want to talk about that for a few minutes. We've seen a breakdown in the geopolitical order of the Middle East. This was an order that was built and sustained by the United States and a core set of regional partners beginning after 1956 and crystallizing in the 1970s. The US, along with Egypt, Israel, and Saudi Arabia, created and sustained a balance of power in the Middle East that favored us, favored our partners, favored our interests. That regional order has broken down. And we've also seen the breakdown of certain states in the region that have collapsed into civil conflict: Libya, Syria, Yemen, and at various points, Iraq. Now, I don't think it's right to say that the Arab uprisings of 2011 created this breakdown in regional order, created the civil conflicts and state collapse. But I do think that that this breakdown in order was an indirect result of the uprisings. Let me explain. The uprisings themselves were driven by some very long building trends in the region, trends in technology and the growth of social media and new forms of communication, trends in economics, the slow breakdown of the clientelistic corporatist model that these states, Arab authoritarian states, relied on. And demographic trends, the rise of a large generation of young people who were connected to the world and intent on playing a greater role in making decisions about their own lives, about their communities, about their societies. We could talk more about that if you want to in the Q&A. But when the uprisings broke out, beginning in December 2010 in Tunisia, and then going on to Egypt, Bahrain, Libya, Syria, really across the region, the uprisings claimed a couple of successes very quickly. In Tunisia in January 2011, in Egypt in February 2011. And then there were other leaders in the region, especially Muammar Gaddafi in Libya and Bashar al-Assad in Syria, who realized that if they just used enough coercion, they could keep themselves in power. And so it's no accident that when we look at the Middle East today, the places in the region that are most violent, most disordered, are the places where leaders chose to respond to popular demands for change with the use of force. Because when leaders turn weapons on their own populations, they create a market in those societies for other guys with guns to protect citizens from their government. And that's how you end up with a civil conflict or an insurgency, or both. And so in the Syrian case, what started as a peaceful uprising turned into a civil conflict, not overnight, but over 7 months. And here we are 9 years later with more than half of the Syrian population displaced from their homes. So I just want to emphasize that the uprisings themselves did not create the conflict. It was the response of political leaders to those uprisings that generated conflict and a lot of the disorder that we see today. Now, that breakdown of order in the region, both within certain states and across the region, it naturally unsettled the governments that survived. And so we're not just looking at civil conflicts in the region today and terrorism and insurgency. We're also looking at geopolitical competition between the states in the region that have the capacity to compete. Many of the civil conflicts that we see have become proxy conflicts where surviving states are battling for power and influence. And all of that violence, competition, disorder, all the anxiety that remaining governments have for their own security and survival, all those things those governments are bringing to the United States. And they are anxious when they see us here at home having our own discussion about how much we really care about the Middle East anymore. So there's a sort of push me, pull you kind of dynamic going on between the United States and our traditional partners in the region. They're trying to convince us that we still really need to care a lot about this region, about their security. We need to keep investing. We need to do more. They're worried that we are leaving them. They feel, relative to the intensive engagement of the last couple of decades, even a minor shift in force posture, for example, feels to them like abandonment. So when we went from 2 carrier groups in the Gulf to 1, and 2 carrier groups in the Persian Gulf was extraordinary historically. But when we went from 2 carrier groups to 1, our partners in the region felt like we had abandoned them. We were walking away. And so what we have in American policy as we sit today is we have a kind of purgatory. We are not now invested enough in the Middle East, in the problems of the Middle East, in the breakdown of order in the Middle East, to establish a new American-led regional order the way we had before. In the midst of this much violence and this many actors with strong interest in the outcomes, it would take a lot for the United States to reestablish a new balance of power in the region that favored our interests. And that's not an investment that we are right now willing to make. But at the same time, we're too enmeshed in the region and the problems of this region to truly focus our attention elsewhere, for example, on competing with China in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, or getting the Russians out of Ukraine and securing democracy in Central and Eastern Europe. So we're in purgatory. We're not able to either achieve our goals in this region or get out of this region and focus our attention elsewhere. Now, what are we going to do about that dilemma? And does the current global crisis create new opportunities for the United States to resolve that dilemma? Those are hard questions. I'm not going to try and answer them right now. What I would like to do in the next few minutes, though, is to emphasize that to get out of this dilemma, we have very difficult, ugly, painful choices that we have to make about what we are no longer going to try to achieve and why, and what we are going to be willing to invest in and why. It's going to carry costs and risks no matter what we choose. And I can tell you that as an analyst. I've been studying US policy in the Middle East for 2 decades. But what I want to focus on now is what it takes when you're not an analyst anymore, but when you're on the other side of the table as a policymaker, when you're figuring out which of those hard decisions you're going to make and how you're going to decide them. What I learned from my own experience serving in the government is that doing policy, as opposed to analyzing policy, takes a different set of skills. It takes some different additional knowledge. So let me give you just 4 quick lessons and some illustrations. of what I learned about the skill set it takes to be a policymaker. Now, when I came to the Brookings Institution in 2003, I was hired to work on the question, as we called it at the time, of Arab reform. In other words, what were the changes and pressures that were building in these Arab authoritarian states? Why was this civil society demand for change building? Why were there more demonstrations? And what should US policy do or say about that? And so I wrote a book, researched and wrote a book between 2003 and 2008 that was called Freedom's Unsteady March, America's Role in Building Arab Democracy. And it was a book that analyzed the new challenges that Arab autocratic regimes were facing. And then it analyzed and critiqued what then the George W. Bush administration was doing about it. Now, President Bush saw authoritarianism in the Arab world through the lens of 9/11 and the challenge we were facing from Al-Qaeda. He saw these autocracies as one of the sources of grievance that kind of created a demand signal, created latent support among Arab populations for the ideology of the Islamist extremists who became Al-Qaeda and flew planes into the World Trade Center. So President Bush embraced democracy promotion in the Arab world. He embraced it as a counterterrorism strategy explicitly. And there were a lot of questions about whether this made sense. So the questions I was trying to answer in the book were two. Are Arab autocrats stable? And should the United States be promoting democracy in the Arab world? And the conclusions I came to in the book were, no, these Arab autocrats are not stable. Their means of control are breaking down. And therefore, yes, we should be supporting those who are striving for democratic change. We should be trying to push the change that is inevitably coming in a positive direction as we can. And the second half of the book was a critique of the Bush administration's approach and of one particular program that the Bush administration created, an assistance program in the Near East Bureau of the State Department called the Middle East Partnership Initiative. So that book came out in 2008. You might remember we had a little presidential election that year. Barack Obama got elected. And I had been a foreign policy advisor for the Obama campaign. And so I put my name in as a potential political appointee in the new administration. So I got a call from Jeff Feltman, who was the Assistant Secretary of State for the Near East at the State Department. He was a career Foreign Service officer, but he said, look, you wrote this book about what's wrong with this assistance program we have in my bureau. Why don't you come into the State Department and fix this program? So it was really one of those completely serendipitous career developments where you actually have a chance to put into practice in government the stuff that you've been writing about outside government. It's very unusual, and it certainly was a chance I was not going to pass up. So I came into the Obama administration in November of 2009, by the time I got through my security clearance and all that kind of stuff. And I stayed through January of 2012. I came in November 2009. The uprisings began in Tunisia in December of 2010. And so all of a sudden, I was no longer in the position of prospectively trying to prepare the US government to deal with changes in the region. The changes had landed on our doorstep, and we had to do the policy formulation on the fly. So let me just give you a couple of lessons from that experience. The first lesson is knowing is not enough. When I went into government, I thought I was prepared. I thought I was up to the task. I'd done the analytical work. I'd come to a set of conclusions and convictions about what the United States should do about what was going on in the Middle East. And I learned that that was not sufficient. The Obama administration was not entirely unprepared. for the Arab uprisings. We were awake to the pressures for change in the region. We had actually begun interagency discussions with state and DOD and Treasury and the White House and so on to talk about what might happen and how we might want to respond. We were building common understandings. We were even drafting a report for the president on our findings. But even if we had gotten that report done and gotten it to the president's desk before the Arab Spring started, we wouldn't have been prepared. Because getting federal agencies to turn the ship of state after decades of American policy that built relationships with these autocratic governments, that supported these dictatorships and monarchies, turning that ship of state is not the work of a moment. And so all the groundwork we did from 2009 to 2010, not enough to prepare. Just let me go through the timing for a minute. Between December 2010 and March 2011, we all of a sudden had mass mobilization, hundreds of thousands or millions of people in the streets in at least 6 major Arab countries. And what that meant for the Bureau where I was working is we weren't just worried about US policy toward these uprisings and trying to get these governments not to shoot protesters and stuff like that. We also had American tourists on the ground. We had American businesses on the ground. We had American diplomats and their families on the ground, all of whom needed to be made safe or evacuated. We had embassies in Libya. We had an embassy that we had to break down and leave. So in a crisis of that magnitude, all the preparation in the world is not going to be enough. Lesson 2. I walked in on my first day in the Near East Bureau at State. I sat down with Jeff Feltman and his deputy, Ron Schlicker, and they said to me, look, you're a political appointee. You're only here for a limited time. What are your priorities? And I said, well, I want to fix this assistance program. But I also think that we need to get ready for leadership transition in Egypt because Hosni Mubarak, who's been president since 1981, he's 79 years old. He hasn't appointed a vice president. There's pressure building for competitive presidential elections instead of a referendum. We need to get ready. I wasn't being Cassandra. I was just looking at the actuarial tables. The guy wasn't going to live forever. And it was wise to think ahead about how we wanted to handle that. So Jeff and Ron kind of looked at me and said, well, good luck with that, and sent me on my way. And I worked with a friend in the department who was actually on the Secretary's direct staff. And we tried to write a memo that would go up to Secretary Clinton's desk to raise this issue and offer some ideas about how to prepare. And we tried for at least a year. I think we tried at least 3 times to get this memo through the clearance process in the State Department to get on the Secretary's desk. And we could not get offices to clear on this memo. Why? Why was it so hard? It seemed like a really important question. But what I learned is that some questions are actually too hard to ask when you are in the policy chair. They're stinky questions. They're uncomfortable questions. Nobody wants to ask them. People were nervous in the State Department about putting that memo forward and asking that question because just asking the question suggests that we're planning for the end of the Mubarak era. And imagine what would happen if the Egyptians were to learn that we had put such a memo on the desk of the Secretary. It would undermine our existing relationship with the president of Egypt. And so understanding that there are some questions that are too hard to ask inside the government, to me, emphasize the importance of the work we do in places like the Brookings Institution and the work that you are training to do outside the government, because part of our role is to identify those stinky questions and get them out on the table and try to answer them and start the conversation that people in government can't afford to start. The bureaucratic risk, the political risk is too high. Third lesson. I do believe that all of our analysis, all our expertise, all our historical understanding helps us see the world clearly, helps us make better decisions. But one lesson I took away from this experience is that all that analytical understanding is no substitute for politics and for a political sensibility. And, you know, we can snark sometimes about political calculations and their role in policymaking, but they turn out to be important. After Mubarak fell, the accumulated wisdom of political science would argue that Egypt should delay having parliamentary elections. It should first write a new constitution. It should get all the political parties organized and prepared to compete effectively on a level playing field with agreed rules of the game. That is not what happened in Egypt. What happened in Egypt is that people, after decades of dictatorship, understood that it was now their opportunity to vote for their new leaders. And by God, they wanted to vote. The military, who was running the country in the wake of Mubarak's resignation, did not want to be in that role. It was an uncomfortable role for them. They wanted to go back behind the curtain where they could exercise power without that kind of public-facing accountability. So they wanted to have elections right away. And so even though the activists understood that a constitution was important, and even though political science would say that waiting and organizing the new rules of the game would get you a better outcome, Egypt went ahead and had elections. Our inability to grasp the demands, the political demands of the moment, left us less well equipped to help Egypt manage that process. The final thing I want to leave you with is this. I was trained as a political scientist. You're all students who are being trained and honing your critical thinking skills. You're learning how to evaluate arguments and evidence and test hypotheses, find the flaws. That's how we're all trained. But when you're sitting in the policymaking chair, like, what is government about? When it's working well, government is about solving people's problems. That's what it's for. And so to be a good policymaker, it's not enough to be able to pick apart arguments. You have to be a creative problem solver. I realized this when I would go into the morning meetings with my boss and my immediate colleagues, the leadership of the Near East Bureau, and we would look at these multiple crises confronting us every day. And I realized that I knew how to offer my boss 100 reasons why the policies people were proposing would not work. But that wasn't what he needed from me in that moment. What he needed from me was a creative idea that maybe I wasn't sure it could work. Maybe I could see how it could go wrong, but it might work and it might make things a little better. That's what policy has to do. It has to solve people's problems. And I'm proud of the work that I do as an analyst and a political scientist. And I think those critical analytical skills are really important. But what I try to integrate into my work now is that element of creativity and that focus on problem solving. And that's what I want to leave you with as we open up for Q&A, is as much time as you spend honing your analytical skills, don't lose your creativity. Don't lose your focus on the desire to make things better, because that is what government is ultimately supposed to be about. So with that, I'll stop and look forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Wittes. I hope everyone can hear me. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your experiences. We do have a list of submitted questions that the Brumley Fellows sent in, and Megan's going to share those But I do want to say now, just looking at the students who we have here, we are connected with them in some way, so I trust them. So all of you, if you want to ask a question once we get through these submitted questions, just use the clap signal, or you know, if that doesn't work, you can send me an email right now, and I can read out your question.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for all of your insight and this wonderful talk and joining us today. So I'm going to go through, these were submitted prior to your talk, so they may be a bit, you know, not directly related, but like she said, we can get to questions for people who are here right after. So one of our fellows asked, based on your experience and research, what do you think the most important factor leads to better policy making? So like process, expertise, a focus on strategic thinking, dealing with issues strategically, or reacting to crises as they occur, etc.
That is a very comprehensive and challenging question. I hope that the few lessons I shared today offer the beginnings of an answer. Among the things listed in the question, I would say all of the above are important. Good process is important. A focus on strategic objectives is important. Expertise is important. You need to have all of this at the table. You're never going to have all of it embodied in one person, or at least it's going to be very, very rare. And so I would say that what is important, and when I think about what leadership looks like in leading through a crisis and developing policy through a crisis, a leader is somebody who keeps the strategic objectives firmly in mind, but encourages the creative problem solving that I talked about, who says to his or her team, here's the challenge. I want you to come up with some ideas about solutions, and I'm here to push those ideas up and to take the heat if things go wrong. That's my job, is to take the heat. Your job is to try and come up with answers. And I think it's also really important for a leader to understand where their own strengths and weaknesses are, and to ensure that they are compensating for their own weaknesses or for the constraints created by the crisis itself, using the people that they have around them. So my boss early on in the uprisings said, you know, I'm on the phone all day with these leaders in the region and coordinating with the Europeans, and I got to get on a plane, you know, but we need to be thinking about some of the longer term questions. Here are the questions. I don't have time to think about it. You 5 people, you're going to be our tiger team thinking about these questions while the rest of the team is dealing with the day-to-day crisis. That's an example of how you try to keep your eye on medium and longer term issues while you deal with the day-to-day crisis stuff you can't escape.
Thank you. Okay, so this one is a bit about career. So how do you think your career might have looked different if you had pursued a law degree in addition to a PhD? And how did your, you know, schooling preparation prepare you for what later happened in your life and your career trajectory?
Okay, I'll say 2 things. Number one is I think that a lot of undergraduates, you know, and I still teach undergraduates at Georgetown. A lot of undergraduates think about a law degree as, you know, an open-ended, flexible option for graduate school. I think that a law degree and the training that you get in law school can be extremely valuable for working in policy, whether you work in policy analysis or you work inside government. A law degree or a social science PhD, you know, history, political science or economics or sociology, you are still doing the same basic thing, which is learning to evaluate arguments and evidence. Law school teaches you a very particular discipline of how to evaluate arguments and evidence. Political science has its own discipline and methodology in how to do that. and other disciplines have their own methodologies and how to do that. But it's still about evaluating arguments and evidence, making arguments and assembling evidence. Okay, so any of those graduate degrees are going to give you training that's useful for that kind of work. But I think that law school is more than other schools. It is a professional degree. It's a professional training program. And there is a degree of kind of brass tacks skill acquisition and knowledge acquisition in law school that you don't necessarily have in a social science PhD program. So I tend to advise my undergraduate students not to go to law school unless they think that they want to practice law, because the kind of ratio of flexible to inflexible, I think, is lower in law school than it is perhaps in other graduate programs. But that's not to say that a law degree is not very useful in the policy space. I worked with a lot of people with law degrees. I work with people with law degrees today. I'm married to a guy who doesn't have a law degree, but has a lot of legal training. And I think it is incredibly valuable.
Thank you. Our next question, so I also wanted to bring this up in general, is about your work with the Leadership Council for Women in National Security.
Great, glad you asked.
Yes. So first, I'd like you to kind of explain the purpose and the goals of the Leadership Council. And also, one of our fellows said they have read critiques by feminists that having more women in national security spaces chiefly serves to improve the optics of American actions, rather than challenging the ideologies underpinning security apparatus. So how do you respond to those critiques, and how does having women in the room change policy outcomes?
Okay, so first let me tell you just what the Leadership Council for Women in National Security is, how it got started. We are a 9-month-old organization, so very new. But essentially this grew out of a group of us who had worked at senior levels in government, most of us as political appointees in various Republican and Democratic administrations. Some of us were career military, career foreign service, civil service, and had reached fairly senior levels. And so we came through at a period when there were still relatively few women in these spaces, and the culture of these spaces was not particularly welcoming. And I have to say, you know, we entered these spaces with the inspiration and support of the even fewer, smaller cohort of women that came ahead of us, people like Michelle Flournoy, or Gail Maddox at the Naval Academy, or Catherine Kelleher. So it's not as though we were pioneers. We were standing on the shoulders of pioneers. But having been through that experience, we felt that we had a good understanding of what the obstacles were to the large cohort of women that now exist at junior and mid-career levels, and really exist if you look at graduate schools. If you look at the populations in the master's programs in international affairs, are majority female. So there's a huge pipeline of female talent all the way up to the mid-level across the national security sector, both in government and out. But they're not there at the senior levels. And so we wanted to build an organization that would focus on what are the obstacles that are keeping women out of the senior level, that are pushing women out of the field, which we have evidence of. And how do we overcome those obstacles? How do we highlight the need to have more women at senior levels of policymaking? Now, I am not, you know, I have studied feminist theory of IR. I appreciate the approaches that are evident in that literature, but I'm not one who believes that female leaders, whether it's in national security or any other area, inherently bring a different content to the table. What I think we have evidence of in a lot of social science data and a lot of studies in the corporate sector is we have a lot of evidence that having greater diversity of identities, experiences, backgrounds at the table produces more creativity, better problem solving, and if you look at the corporate sector, better outcomes. In other words, companies with more diverse boards perform better than companies with less diverse boards. So I think that there is, what we have evidence of is a clear inherent benefit in doing the work of government, creative problem solving, when you have more diverse teams. And that means that we are not doing as good a job in national security policymaking right now as we could be doing, because there is all this diverse talent that's not at the table. And by the way, that's not just about gender. It's also about race and ethnicity. It's about personal background and educational experience. And one of the things that we're doing with the Leadership Council is we are networking with other diversity organizations that work with other identity groups, so that we can all build this project together. I don't believe that a woman-led world would be a more peaceful world, necessarily. I do believe that a world with more women at the decision-making table will have better policy outcomes for people than a world with policy tables dominated by white men.
Thank you. And thank you for the great work of the Leadership Council. It's a great organization. So another question from a fellow. So given, and you touched on this just a piece in your talk, after COVID-19, how will US foreign policy change? What are the opportunities for somewhere like China, also more specifically for in the Middle East?
Yeah. Well, that is the $60,000 question right now. I think every think tank in Washington and beyond is churning away, putting together proposals for projects looking to answer that question. I am actually right now at work with my colleague Mara Carlin on an article about how the COVID crisis is affecting the Middle East and affecting the US role in the Middle East. This whole question that I was talking about today, still unanswered, about how much we really care about this region, how much we want to invest in it. I think the pandemic is changing the calculus somewhat for the United States. I haven't worked this out fully. I'll just give you a couple of our thoughts right now. One clear one is the impact of the oil price crash on Gulf states and on the balance of power in the region between the Gulf Arab states and Iran. The Gulf Arab states, almost all of them except Saudi Arabia, are very small. They are not major military powers. They don't have a lot of diplomatic capacity, but they do have a lot of money. And they have used their money to try and influence the balance of power in the region since 2011. They they gave Egypt on the order of $3 or $4 billion a year for years and years after the coup that displaced the first elected president. The Emiratis have been sending weapons to support one side in the Libyan civil war in violation of a UN Security Council arms embargo, by the way. The Turks have been violating the arms embargo on the other side of that civil war. So countries have been using their economic resources, and the Gulf in particular, to try and shape the balance of power in the region. Now they are going to be feeling very, very poor, and they have to face, as all of us have to face, major domestic economic challenges with less money to work with. So they're going to be doing less around the region. Now look, the Iranians are also impoverished. They've been under basically complete oil sanctions now for several years, and the oil price crash and the COVID crisis are affecting them too. But the Iranians have years of practice and demonstrated capacity at exercising influence in the region, even when they don't have a lot of money. And in fact, the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, has been able to do well under sanctions and not under sanctions. When they're under sanctions, the IRGC takes the lead in smuggling operations and gets money that way. And when they're not under sanctions, when they're not under sanctions, they get money from the Iranian government to conduct their activities. So they win either way. And I think that means net, the balance of power in the region is likely to shift in favor of Iran in the coming years. What the United States wants to do about that, I think, is a complicated question, but that's one major impact that I see.
Thank you. And I'm going to go to our last question from the fellows before I open it up to the Zoom call, the audience. So with the current rhetoric about the potential annexation of the West Bank, do you see this as a facet of democratic backslide, or does it point to another factor at work? And how will this complicate or strengthen the relationship between the United States and Israel?
Yeah, well, this really could be a turning point for Israel, for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, for Israel's relationships with its immediate neighbors, and potentially for the U.S.-Israel relationship as well. I don't think that Israel has come to the brink of annexation in the West Bank as a result of a breakdown of Israeli democracy. We can have a debate or a discussion about whether to characterize Israel as a democracy, given that it has engaged in a multi-decade occupation of a population that doesn't get to vote and doesn't have citizenship. But within the citizenship of Israel, which includes 20% Arab citizens of Israel, by the way, it is a functioning democracy. It is a democracy that is facing a lot of challenges from populism, a lot of challenges that are degrading its democratic discourse, that are introducing very illiberal dimensions. And there are policy proposals on the table by Israeli political parties and in the Israeli parliament that I think would undermine the strength of Israeli democracy. But the policy debate that has taken place on what to do about Israel's occupation in the West Bank and the question of annexation, that has all taken place in a democratic context. And it doesn't make me happy, but there is a majority in the Israeli Knesset in support of annexation. And so if this gets brought to the parliament, to the Knesset on July 1st, which is what is in the new governing coalition agreement, I think it will pass. Now, what are likely to be consequences of such a decision? I think it would put tremendous pressure on the Israeli-Jordanian peace agreement, because it has implications for elements of that peace agreement that relate to Jerusalem and that relate to the Jordan Valley border between Jordan and the West Bank and Jordan and Israel. I think it would place tremendous political pressure on the Jordanian monarchy and the Jordanian government, because more than half of the Jordanian population are of Palestinian origin, and because it would undermine the peace treaty. So if Israel goes ahead with annexation, might it end up in a crisis with Jordan? Might it lead to collapse of the Jordanian monarchy? I don't want to be alarmist, but I do think we have to ask that question. Might it lead to violent responses among some Palestinian movements? Yes, it might. Might it lead the Palestinian Authority to do what it's been threatening to do for years and dissolve itself? In other words, hand back to Israel complete responsibility for its military occupation? Yeah, it might. So, you know, there's a majority in principle in the Israeli Knesset to go ahead with the annexation, but the Israel are significant and potentially quite severe. And so I hope that a parliamentary debate, if and when it takes place, will be rigorous and will address all these questions. Now, what does it mean for the United States? Israeli security stability and Jordanian security and stability are important American interests. These are important American partners. And partners in the region and internationally, not just with respect to one another. So I think that that's something that American political leaders should be communicating clearly to Israeli audiences that this is not a crisis that the United States is looking for or finds to be helpful, and it's not something we should be doing. You know, the Trump administration chose to pursue this proposal for Israeli annexation, I think, for reasons that have very little to do with national security and foreign policy, and have a lot to do with President Trump's own domestic political constituencies. So I don't think that this was a decision that was congruent with American interests, and I hope that the United States will not, in the end, recognize an Israeli annexation.
Thank you so much. So now I'd like to open it up to everyone in the call. If you could either have a raise your hand feature or the clap feature or something like that, where I could see the call on you. Or if you don't have that, then just speak up and say your name, and I'll, because I see a few of you have unmuted. Go ahead, Matthew.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. When the Arab Spring started, I think that there was an expectation that this would lead to lasting change towards human rights and democracy in the region, and that authoritarian and military regimes in places like Egypt and maybe other countries would not be able to put the metaphorical genie of liberty back in the bottle, so to speak. 10 years later, what has been kind of the secret sauce that has kind of helped authoritarian regimes in the region to prevent people from returning to mass street protest, ignoring, of course, the short-term COVID-related reasons?
Great question, Matthew. I would say a few things. Number one is the pressures that led to the uprisings are still there. The fact that these clientelistic state-driven economies, and I mean state-driven, not state-owned necessarily, but state-driven, they are not functioning well. They are not doing a good job of providing services for people. They are not providing sufficient growth to create new jobs for the unemployed, much less the young people who are entering the market. They are not helping these countries succeed in the context of the global economy. And the youth bulge has not disappeared. And the demands for participation and accountability and government responsiveness have not disappeared. And just over the last year, we saw renewed protests in Sudan, in Algeria, in Iraq, in Lebanon. In Iraq, it brought down the government. In Sudan, it brought down the military regime and led to a pacted transition negotiated between the military and the civil society opposition. In Algeria, it led to finally the withdrawal of Bouteflika, from his sort of weekend at Bernie's style endless presidency. So these pressures are still there. They are still creating popular mobilization, and they are still creating change in the region. This story is not over. There was, however, this counter-revolutionary pressure from authoritarian regimes, and a number of them succeeded. In the Bahraini case, it was pure coercion. The Bahrainis, with backup from the Saudis, crushed the protests with violence and arrested tons and tons of people. And they are still treating a large chunk of their population as suspect. And conducting political trials and, forbidding basic exercise of civil liberties. So, coercion works at a certain level. For the Egyptian case, you had, as I said, we went through elections in Egypt fairly quickly without a chance for most political movements to organize and develop and make their case. And that led to the outcome that we predicted, which is that the Islamist movements, primarily the Muslim Brotherhood, dominated the elections. Because through all the decades of autocracy, the Brotherhood were the only organized force allowed to survive in the country. Formal political movements were crushed, but the Brotherhood, because it didn't formally compete in politics kind of survive below the radar. So they dominated the elections, they won the presidency, they won plurality in the parliament, and ultimately the military, with support from the Saudis and Emiratis and others, and with support of a chunk of the population, said that that brotherhood governance was intolerable. And I'll be quite honest, the elected president, within a few months of taking office, began to carry out actions that were undemocratic in nature. And so they weren't wrong to make that critique, but a military coup obviously derailed any possibility for democratic change. But I don't think the story's over in Egypt, where they now have tens of thousands of political prisoners, and the country is deeply, deeply divided. I don't think the story is over in a lot of places in the region. And I think actually the biggest success of the Arab Spring was not the autocrats' counter-revolution. The biggest success of the Arab Spring was the purveyors of violence, the terrorists, the insurgent extremists, who have found just vast space within which to work, new money, new opportunities, new strength, new recruits. They were the real winners.
Thank you.
Thank you. Diana Bolsinger, you can go ahead.
Hi, first of all, I want to thank you for an absolutely fascinating presentation. In fact, thanks to Megan for bringing you out here. You made a couple allusions in the process of your presentation to the impact that climate change is having in undermining stability in the region. And I'd be interested in just hearing you elaborate on your perspective on how bad you expect it to get, how you expect it to impact, etc.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen environmental impacts on regional stability in the Middle East for a while. And I think climate change is exacerbating those impacts significantly. So, you know, Yemen has been water poor for a long time, and that has retarded human development as well as economic development. Yemen is now water poor at the point of crisis, where the lack of access to clean water, you know, resulted in a massive cholera outbreak over the last couple of years. And there are real questions about whether this country is going to be habitable on the other side of the civil war, even if the fighting ended tomorrow. The challenges for basic human survival in this country are significant. And so, you know, there have been Yemeni migrants flowing through the fairly porous border into Saudi Arabia for a long time. I was down on near the border in Jizan a couple of years ago, and there were a lot of Yemeni refugees, whether you call them war refugees or environmental refugees. I don't really know what drove them to leave, but they were, you know, begging on the streets of Jizan. So I expect that we will see those kinds of impacts only increase. In places where there are already resource strains, like Jordan, which is also very water poor, you know, the government up until now has been able to purchase water at increasing costs. And that will get harder as Jordan gets poorer and water gets more expensive. But there are also opportunities for the region to transform the way it thinks about environmental security. If there were stable Israeli, Palestinian, Jordanian political agreements, for example, there is a wonderful opportunity for a win-win-win arrangement whereby Israel, which has developed very effective desal technology, shares that technology with Palestinians and Jordanians, where Jordan becomes a market for Israel's new gas reserves, and where the three parties work together to replenish the Dead Sea, which is drying up, and which is important both for tourism, for environmental reasons, and for economic reasons as a source of mineral exploitation. So I would like to believe that in a world in which the macro politics were more amenable, there are opportunities for environmental cooperation that could really be game changers for the people of this region. But I think that we're probably a long way from that world.
Thank you.
Okay, looks like Faye has a question. Faye, if you want to go ahead. Oh, maybe not.
I'm sorry, my thing ducked out like I thought might happen. I don't know how long you've stopped for, but.
That's all right. We're trying to see. So Faye has his hand raised, but I don't know. Okay, here we go.
No, I don't have a question. That's a clap.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Do we have questions from anyone else then?
Oh, yep.
Go ahead, Audrey.
Thank you. You mentioned that you viewed the Trump administration's support of annexation of the West Bank as due to pressures from the domestic side rather than geopolitical strategy. I was wondering if you think this could be a lasting influence beyond the Trump administration, and if you could talk more about what this means for the future of U.S.-Israel relations.
Well, look, domestic politics always have an impact on U.S. foreign policy. That's not new. If you're are you asking specifically about the kind of domestic political impact I think is relevant here? Are you asking if the impact of evangelical Republican constituencies is going to be of lasting importance?
Yes, I was asking specifically, like, if you think the influence of evangelicism on foreign policy in Christian Zionism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, thank you. I think it's an important question. First, I think I would say that the role of this particular political constituency is not, it didn't just suddenly appear. It's been building over a period of time. And I think that this is a community that got politically mobilized beginning in the 1980s, was focused initially primarily on topics of direct interest to the community, like other profoundly religious communities in the country. They cared about charter schools and funding for parochial education. They cared about certain issues that we might describe under the umbrella term of culture war, but issues that are relevant for social policy on things like abortion. But over time, I think as the community grew more politically engaged and mobilized, their interests grew as well. And that has included, with respect to the Middle East, growing interest in the situation of Christian communities in the region. That has been a major focus, and Israel. And of course, there are Israel-related organizations and interest groups who have cultivated the evangelical community's Christian Zionism as a way of bolstering their own political support for their own views. So there's been a sort of mutual construction of this Christian Zionist political advocacy, if you will. So I think that the influence has grown, and I think that you see it very, very strongly in the Trump administration, mostly because this is a president who doesn't have strong priors on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I mean, and this was evident in his first press conference with Benjamin Netanyahu in 2017, he said, you know, 2 state, 1 state, whatever the parties want. Like, I just want to help you guys come to agreement. I don't really care about the substance. And so if that's your starting position, then you're going to be more open to influence of people whose opinion you care about than you would if you had strong priors. So I think that's part of the explanation. Another part of the explanation is that President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu have helped one another with their domestic political constituencies. So, you know, President Trump has helped validate Netanyahu's argument to his own voters that he's in a league of his own when it comes to international diplomacy. And Netanyahu has helped to validate Trump to his voters as the most pro-Israel president in American history. And so these two guys are very much, you know, coordinating and helping one another with their domestic challenges. And so I think that's what's new in the current period, is the intensity of the entanglement between Israeli and American domestic politics and the US-Israel relationship. Now that that entanglement is so intense, I think it is going to be difficult to disentangle. But I do think that and so yes, I think it's going to have a profound impact on the relationship. I've actually been trying to do a little writing on this year. One consequence I see in the current administration is that the actual substance of the bilateral relationship, what the American government and the Israeli government spend time talking to each other about and working on together, the scope of that has actually shrunk, because the two leaders are so focused on the domestic politics that they're not doing all the other bilateral stuff that would otherwise signal a really strong relationship. You know, trade cooperation, visa waiver program, all that kind of stuff. They just don't care about it as much as they care about the symbolic things that help with the domestic politics.
Well, thank you. So if no one has any other questions, we're going to go and close the talk. Let me close by thanking Dr. Wittes for being with us today and your wonderful insights. For the audience, be sure to follow Dr. Wittes on her Twitter at TCWITTES, and listen to her on the incredible podcast, Rational Security, and read her work at the Center for Middle East Policy at Brookings. So thank you all and stay safe.
Thank you.